All right, so today's conversation is DAOs and the creative mindset. Got a little agenda here to roll through, but before we do that, let's get a quick little intro of the crew here. We'll start with Jess, and then we'll kick it over to Jonathan, and then Kayam. Yeah, here we go.
Hey folks, my name is Jess, and I lead a DAO called Seed Club. We're a Web3 accelerator structured as a DAO, have backed 54 projects, including one that Jeff is leading here as well, and yeah, really deep into the space and having a lot of fun.
I'm Jonathan. I'm a contributor to Jump. I also direct community for a digital fashion startup, but more relevant to this discussion, I'm just a serial overthinker, overtalker, over-researcher into DAOs, constantly coming up with ways. I walk down the sidewalk and there's a hole. I'm like, man, I wish there was a DAO that could fix that.
I am Kayam, and I'd just like to echo what Jonathan said, and I am an overtalker, oversharer as well. But my background started in immersive media back in 2007. Worked for the company that invented Google Street View, got to take that technology into the agency world, and then that's where the creative aspects of what transpired. And during the pandemic, lots of online time, so I became a DAO lurker, contributor, and then instigator. So now I'm like, DAO or never. So there you go.
Awesome. All right, so when we talk about DAOs and the creative mindset, I mean, the creative mindset, there's been a lot of creative work that's been fantastic that's come out of mankind, for the last couple thousand years, right? So like the creative mindset and the creative process is something that I think we've actually we've done a really good job at, right? And we've produced a lot of great creative work. And so the question is how do DAOs start to empower that a little bit more? So I'm gonna tee up the agenda here. We actually have a very structured agenda. So we're gonna start with how to make a Super Bowl ad. Then we're gonna go into co-creation. Then centralization versus decentralization. How does that work in the creative process, right? Then we're going to move into creative flow from DAO to DAO, IP strategies, the emergence of CCO, things of that nature, and then how to retain your best creative talent, especially in the DAO ecosystem. So we're going to start with how to make a Super Bowl ad. Has anybody ever made a Super Bowl ad? No, awesome. Okay, this is how you make a Super Bowl ad. So my background, I'm sorry I didn't introduce myself, Jump, Jeff, founder, creator of Jump.
They're synonymous.
Yeah, so my background is agency work. And there's, for several years, I was able to be a part of some really great creative teams and creative strategies and processes that I think translate across sort of industries, right? They're not necessarily unique to Web3. And when you talk about how to make a Super Bowl ad, it's one of the biggest creative stages in the world. This is the process that I went through, which is we get the call from the client. It's like, okay, we've secured $6 million in media. We have $4 million production budget. We're ready to spend $10 million in about a month, right? That's how to make a Super Bowl ad. So how do you go about doing that? You bring about 100 people together. You split into 2 to 3 person teams. Everybody has about 3 days to come up with their best idea and their best pitch. And then you come together as a group and you present, right? Kind of sounds like a group of 100 people hanging out in Discord, right? Where we've got something we want to go do. And we need ideas, and we need to vet those ideas. So after we pitch those ideas to each other, we basically vote on the top ones that we want to move forward with, right? So then what happens to the people whose ideas didn't make it? They have to join the teams of the ideas that did make it, right? So nobody's left behind in this process. Everybody's at the table. But maybe some of those ideas that didn't make it are embedded and help inform and evolve some of these newer ideas. And that process basically repeats itself over the course of a week or two. Lots of time pressure involved. I feel like time pressures have a lot of help in terms of fueling creativity. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, there's a top idea that's collectively decided by that creative group. And everybody actually helped produce that, not just the original pitch team on that day one. So if you've ever been curious how a Super Bowl ad is made. That's certainly one way to make it. But that leads us into DAOs and co-creation and creators, right? Jess, I'm going to throw it to you first because you have a lot of experience in this place, especially leading entrepreneurs that are building DAOs that have this amazing creative idea. One of the things that you've coined that I've held on to a lot is like, what's your call to adventure? And this is like this higher calling creative idea and process. And so, yeah, how does that call to adventure lead to great creative ideas? And how maybe have you seen that co-creation process play out?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no one way, right? So it's happening in a multitude of ways. And, one of the reasons we started C Club was that we'd be in the room with so many smart people who are building these things and sort of discovering those alongside you. I think maybe the most interesting example today from within our ecosystem is the Headless Chaos or Chaos Band. 77 artists came together to write, create, mint, and publish songs. They've released them both as NFTs and have a big game plan to sort of take that out to the world. And embedded in sort of the work that was done to bring those people together is a whole lot of experiments on this. How do we structure incentives? How do we reward work? How do we do that in a way that where there's no central entity making those decisions? And then how do you go and sustain that into the market moving forward? So I don't think we know how to do this well. I think we're seeing exciting experiments like Chaos. We're seeing experiments like Nouns DAO, which is really flipping that on its head and saying, hey, here's money, come pitch us to do something with that money. And these are all really interesting things, but at the edges, there's a lot of issues that come up. And so, working through those specific frictions, I think, is the work that's getting done by the most exciting organizations in the space right now. And so, yeah, there's many ways to skin the cat. And I think just the idea of sort of, leveraging incentives and ensuring folks are sort of connected in those incentives at the meta layer, which is sort of absent, I think, in the Super Bowl example that you gave here, is the fundamental innovation here, and there's just a ton of open green space to go play in there.
So I love how you didn't see my notes before this, and you jumped right to the next thing, which was awesome. So the Chaos Band, right? Like, that was a group of 80 creatives, musicians, visual artists, thinkers, kind of in the space, in the music space. 80 people came together as a course of 8 weeks, right? So 2 months, and they produced 40 songs, right? 40 plus songs with visual artwork associated with it. Released it into a beautiful website and minting experience, 0.2 ETH each. So we're talking about DAOs and the creative mindset, and we have this example of 80 people coming together, creating an album of 40 songs and all the visual art and distributing it. And their compensation model was absolutely fascinating. So that kind of leads to one of the other topics of the today, which is how do you retain your best creative sort of minds, right? You've got to create the stage, you've got to set the table, if you will. You've got to reward them. There's a sense of ownership, right, in DAOs that tokens enable creative people to sort of own that creative work in really new and interesting ways. And Jonathan, I know you dove really hard into the sort of the Chaos machine and sort of the process and how they executed. So I'd love to hear some of those insights or some of those key takeaways from this amazing group of people that produced this music.
Yeah, I think what's most interesting coming out of Chaos Band is their economics team had a very clear understanding that you cannot pay to play and create with a creative person or creativity. I mean, I've worked in marketing across my career, and sometimes it does require me to be creative, and I'm often very bad at it. But when I get put against a deadline, and like I need to do this so I don't get fired, and it's just all this pressure, and so when you do that in this context of making music, I mean, how many stories are there of bands that don't hit their deadlines to get their albums, or authors getting their books done? So the economics team at Chaos really figured out this interesting model where there are basically multiple channels of payment. At the top level, you have a UBI, which for them was like 0.3 ETH. That's what, like $900, $1,000, depending on the price of ETH, which I know today is very sad for.
Stop talking about that.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Rejected, it's not there. It's on sale. You're right, Chad. That was an opt-in, and there's no penalty of taking out of the system early, which was also an interesting thing because normally I would say if you take cash out of the pot before we realize, then you give up a little bit downstream. Chaos didn't do that. The second layer is they have, I think they have like a self-evaluation method, and you can say I did not contribute or I contributed low, medium, high each week, and I think there's some kind of compensation tied to that. They're using Coordinate, and then the final piece that comes to mind is. So they've got royalties and shares in the primary sale and then royalties on the secondaries. But what's really fascinating at the end is they came up with this methodology they're calling liquid splits. So basically, you get 1/1000th of the pie, or maybe 1% of the pie. If there are 100 people in this pie, everyone gets 1%. But that 1% is realized as 10 NFTs that each equate 2.1% of the larger pie, of the whole distribution of revenue. And so what's insane about that is like, okay, so I own 1%, I get 1% of the dividend that's assigned, as we've all agreed to in a vote, but now I can speculate and buy and sell in and out of shares of that revenue. If I see conflagration coming that's not going to be creatively productive, I'm selling out. Someone else can go have my shares of near zero probably. But if I know this album is fire, that song slaps, this visual art is really singing, then I'm going to go hit up everyone else who's hard up for cash and say, hey, can I buy your slice? So you can end up with just insane, like, you could dominate if you had the capital to do it and get 99.9%. But that's, of course, very unlikely because at that point, it's not a DAO.
That's awesome. That's awesome. We're going to get to nouns right after, next, and Kayam, you're going to lead us in that. But in just kind of that summary there, this is this fascinating compensation model of UBI, some income to start the project, then a self-reported mechanism on a weekly basis of what did I do? Did I contribute a lot or did I not contribute this week, right? And then that third component, which is peer-to-peer evaluation of this is how much value each individual brought to the table, right? Because when we really think about creative work, it's so hard to value, right? In a lot of ways, and I dealt with this in a really painstaking way in the agency world and doing creative work. You're valued on an hourly basis. How do you value work on an hourly basis? It's really difficult, but that's the business model that we value creative work, and it's challenging. So I really like this three-part model, and then it tops it off with that liquidity component with those shares. And so as this album was sold, I think the last time I looked at it, there were $600,000 USD in sales, and that's funneling through sort of those smart contracts into the individuals that participated in this DAO, own this piece of creative work, and then can sell their shares. So kudos to Chaos Band. That's such an incredible case study. I think individuals are going to even take it further than that. But let's talk about nouns and IP strategies, right? And that kind of creative work. What kind of ownership layer should exist around creative work? What should you own? What should you give away? How should you let the broader world and your community participate? Nouns is an interesting example there. So why don't you just give us the top line of nouns and then talk about why it's interesting to you?
For me personally, how many people are familiar with the nouns? Nouns.wtf. How many familiar with Lil Nouns? All right, okay. So nouns are cutesy-wootsy 8-bit generative NFTs. They will be created for the end of time. And so there is one auctioned off every day. And the instigators of the Noun DAO, I can't remember how many there are, 10 or 11. Let's give them a hand of applause. They created the system where every 10th noun goes into their that's their payment. And everything else goes into the treasury. So people aren't buying just the noun, they're buying a voting right. And I could buy 5 nouns and my voting right goes up a little bit. But the most amazing thing about CCO is Noun DAO has created the opportunity for wealth generation on 10 other DAOs that just pool funds together to maybe get a noun. And then you have nouns.party, which is an auction site. So another entity that's creating wealth generation off of an original CC0 project. So that's like Nike going, hey, you know what? We don't need trademarks and copyrights anymore. We just want to share the wealth. That's probably unlikely. So now Nouns comes in and goes, we're the new that. Just do it, right? So let's just do this. And so what they've done is created a treasury in a very short period of time. 320 days, not even, like under a year, right? So 200 and some odd days, they've accumulated a gigantic treasury. What do they do with it? Let's get glasses to kids who can't get them. Let's get a skate park in a developing neighborhood, and let's create some culture within that. Let's donate 5 ETH to 5 different charities to begin with. So you have people with maybe disposable ETH, but they're putting it to use. And so the functionality and the utility out of being or belonging to this group, something that is creating the CC0 and giving wealth generation to many people. Like Jack, I can't remember the visual, I can't remember what his whole thing, the visual. Anyways, there's a fellow who does visuals, UI stuff, and he went into the NFT world. He just put the blue glasses on a hat and $45,000 in 8 minutes. So it's that kind of thoughtful, creative work where you're like, you're giving us some tools, you're giving us wealth generation tools that we can, with our creativity, do stuff with, and then on top of that, you have a gigantic treasury which we can just go, hey, I want to do this with the nouns. Is that cool? Do we get a consensus? Let's vote for it and incubate it. Going back to the Super Bowl, Pepsi gave up their $25 million buy-in. And what they did was create something like the nouns did and said, hey, put in a proposal. We'll give you the money to go do that in the name of Pepsi, and we'll support you. But they didn't have the DAO utilities or the tools at that time. But Nouns is coming in with CC0, and that's an amplifier, because it's not just Pepsi, it's every beverage gets to have the chance to do this and create wealth generation. So that's why I'm like gung-ho on Nouns, because anyone can think about it and go, let's create something out of it, let's share it with the community, and hopefully, if it's a really good idea, we can bring it to fruition.
Amazing. Jess, I'd love to hear your take on Nouns and Lil Nouns. I know you've thought deeply about that project and that ecosystem and how it's involved, and I know you're participating. I know you're a creative guy. So yeah, talk about the DAO and the creative mindset and Nouns and what's interesting there to you.
Yeah, I think this is one of the projects that most people just don't quite get, and so we're going to see a lot of copycats and things, and I think it's all these pieces that are coming together that make it work. So the CC0, the really novel perpetual funding mechanism, and this idea of ultimately taking, it's a decentralized core treasury and a bunch of centralized entities sort of making proposals to sort of fund that work. So I think all those things together are really interesting, but I think the Nike example is probably the best example. Like, these glasses are probably some of the best branding that I've seen in the space generally. It makes it incredibly easy to perpetuate that meme. I think the best way to describe Nouns, Jacob Horn from Zora describes it as ETH with the meme, and just this idea of having this sort of mechanism to continue to perpetuate this brand into the world in a way that is not encumbered by any legal restrictions necessarily, I think is fascinating. So we're really interested in like, how do communities form capital so they can go do big things? Community tokens, DAOs give ownership to people in digital communities or in digital spaces that you just can't do using existing technology. Nouns has found the best way to maximize the amount of value that's going into a treasury and do so in an on-chain way that reduces a lot of risk from the initial funding partners. And I think that's going to lead to a lot of interesting things, but expect to see it misapplied in many places, but also applied really interesting ways in new industries. I think we're going to see like this sort of narrative building DAOs, IP-based DAOs, folks that are leaning into DAO-owned IP, CCO on the opposite side. So there's a ton of experimentation that's being done in this space, but I think those three pieces coming together are what makes this unique right now. And who knows, will Little Nouns be as successful and interesting as a derivative as the main project? I don't know. I think there'll be a lot of different examples there, but definitely one to watch.
So some of those key takeaways when we're talking about IP strategies, we're talking about just freely giving your creative work out there for the community, but there is that mechanism of the NFT itself, and owning that NFT right, that gives you that governance within the project, but the creative itself is free for anybody to use. So Noun's DAO is not going to go sick a legal team after some group of people or an individual that takes those glasses and or a noun and starts to propagate the meme. They're not going to do it, right? And that's just so fundamentally different than every sort of IP strategy, creative strategy that we've ever seen.
I think there is one big challenge with this project right now, and that is that we are notoriously bad at deploying large treasuries in DAOs. And so these guys are great at building those treasuries. It'll be really interesting to see how they're actually able to deploy it. Because yes, not only are they not going to go after folks for using these classes or that IP, they're trying to actively contribute it or encourage that. So yeah, they have high velocity proposals. It's really exciting, but there's tens of millions of dollars locked away in treasuries, billions more broadly in the DeFi space that are not actively being used. Is that a good thing? Probably not.
I was just going to say, I'm like, it's an amazing tool. Like, we don't know what's going to happen, but the fact that it is now, we're going into these realms of unknown. So now we have a large treasury. How do we evaluate the proposals? Like, now they're getting into like agency quality. Before it was like, okay, so I want to take a noun and I want to go like put it on a skateboard, and that's cool. But now we're going into, I'd like to, a multi-channel campaign that's doing education, or now we've got a studio that's creating movies. Like, where does that level come up where it's that on-chain voting or that consensus? How do we evaluate it where it is a Super Bowl ad where we put 100 people in there and then go, what's the best idea? So I do see that as a challenge, going, how do you streamline that and then create the efficiency within it?
Awesome. We've got about 5 minutes left, so if there are questions and you want to make your way up, feel free to do that. We're going to keep jamming. So there's this concept. This is something I've struggled with, and so I just want y'all's take on this. We're in Texas, so we say y'all. Which is the idea of centralization versus decentralization, the idea, especially in the creative process, the idea of the solo creator going in and doing this creative work and coming up with these ideas and sharpening those ideas and then presenting it out into the world. We've got amazing examples of so many of the greatest bands in the world, right? They were bands, but there's like two people in the band that like drove the creative work and drove the creative vision. The Beatles being one of those sort of great sort of two-person creative teams. And so, there's that tension there, right, of where does that creativity come from? Where does it start? The tension between centralization and decentralization, and how does a great creative product get made? So, Jonathan.
That's the one you want to toss to me. Okay. No, I was prepared for the other one.
I wasn't prepared for this one, so thanks, Jonathan.
Okay, let's freeform this. Okay, all right. So I'm gonna cheat and ask the audience. How many of you have ever done a group project?
There we go.
Theoretically, everyone should be raising your hands.
This is true.
I hope you all went to school at some point. All right. And how many of you have been on a project where you were the one who got stuck doing all the work? And how many
everybody, more people raised their hands on that one than the one before.
Happened.
I don't know what happened.
Something's getting lost here. So that's the problem, is the free rider. At least to my mind in this case and that's where I think like Chaos had a great method of like, be honest with yourselves, and then to back that up if you were too harsh or on yourself, or maybe you contribute in some other kind of immeasurable ways. As Jeff had mentioned earlier, you can't really measure every single part of the puzzle. They had another method for allotting reward to people who contributed. So in the centralization versus decentralization, I have no flipping clue, and I think what really matters is the structure that you want to buy into, and do people actually work to make that structure work to get to the end? Because there are a couple different approaches. Chaos, a bunch of creatives came together and then they did their thing. I hope they had at least one project manager in that group. And then you have another approach I haven't seen, but I'd be interested to see what, we have Jeff Sluss up here, the king of social token of thought leadership there. If you drop a social token like Portrait Le Man or AC, and then turn that into a DAO and figure out like what are the things you're willing to concede control over to a vote based on the people that have bought in, earned in, or were lucky. And that is something I'm really interested in seeing is if Kayem is the creative in this group of 4, and then we all decide we're going to fund Kayem's creative pursuits, and then how do we balance that tension with what we want versus what he's giving us? That is a model I'd like to see some creators try. The best example that comes to mind is Alex Mazmej building Showtime, funding his life to build this, moving to San Francisco, dropping out of college or high school. I don't know. He's like 17. I don't know. I'm old, and I'm the youngest one on this panel, but I feel the oldest. But so that those kinds of models, I'd love to see more of. So sorry, that a little bit divergent, but
I think I'm glad I put you on the spot because I love the group project analogy. It's like in these discords, that's like the perfect sort of starting point of like. Actually, we've already all been there a few years ago, and we've kind of worked through some of these problems. But Jess, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I'm far more interested in owning and being a part of a Swiftie community than trying to own a token that represents Taylor Swift. I think like these fan clubs are interesting, funding mechanisms that enable creators to do things, but creative work should be best done by creative people, and the idea of using consensus to do that is just silly in my opinion.
Yeah, let's go to our first question. Let's hear it.
Thank you. I'm curious, with y'all all being big thinkers and big creative thinkers, what is your grandest vision for DAO technology?
and to be clear, we're the big thinkers just because we're tall. But what's your name? What's your name, by the way?
Jordan.
So what's our sort of grand vision for the technology? Like what it's going to enable? I think.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think what DAOs and tokens enable is digital ownership, and I think being able to empower folks who are creating so much value on the internet today to have a stake in and a say in and an upside in that, I think is the fundamental thing. And the reality is we just need a lot more experiments that are out in the space. I think a while ago I tweeted that we need more DAOs, not more DAO tools, and I got an immense amount of interest on Twitter from that, and I think that's still the case. So I just hope we see many, many more experiments. I don't know what it looks like. I think we had Aaron right on earlier today talking about one vision of DAOs. Love the guy, disagree very deeply with him on certain aspects of it. And so I think, how do we create places where more people, even absent of having significant capital, can come, participate, earn, and see the value they create on the internet recognized?
My grand vision, I have like two parts of this. one is what can we accomplish in a year, and then what can we accomplish overall? So short term, I'd love to see something where there's a fully compliant, fully regulated, like, you know, you got the vault, you got the safety deposit boxes and the tellers kind of bank, and they create the technology where a fiat account can be governed by DAO-based voting. We already have that with crypto, but like we saw at the last panel, some lawyers don't take crypto. There are plenty of ways that you can't use cryptocurrency just flatly. It's not accepted. So fiat is still there, it's still valid, and if you can import those signals out into the bank and then distribute the funds accordingly, I think that would be great. The last thing that I want to say is ultimately I think DAOs will be successful as we automate everything. So once we become a confederacy of robots, I think we'll see DAOs really reach their full potential.
Amazing. I think we're at time, so thank you everybody. We're going to light up the bar. It's happy hour time.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy your day.
Thanks, folks.